Hello and welcome to the Green Canary. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the election. Oh no, really? There's an election on? Haven't you heard? Yes, there's an election. It's almost upon us, thank God. But is there change in the political wind? That's the key question. Well, don't know if we can answer that, but we can tell you that there is change in Australia's wind generation capacity, and we'll have a chat about that a little later on. We're also going to run through the reef bleaching story this week that we briefly warned you was coming last week. There's plenty more on the pod this week. I'm Ant Sharwood, and it is normally at this time that I'd throw to someone much more electable than myself. Some might even say more delectable than myself. I speak, of course, of Elfie Scott. Elfie is not here again this week. I do apologise, but she's finishing a massive project. Going to be amazing when her book is finally finished. Give her strength. She's literally on the last few pages. So the banter between us will not be here. There'll be no banter. There'll sort of just be, I guess, anter, as in, interactions between you, the listener, and I. And listen, speaking of listeners, we had more than ever before this week. So thank you all so much for tuning in, for becoming Green Canary regulars. And also, speaking of ants, not myself, but ants generally, I forgot to mention, we have a massive problem with a type of ants in this country, and we're going to have a little chat to someone about that later in the show as well. But first of all, I did mention there's an election on. Yes, you may be aware of that. And this is actually our last podcast before the May 21 federal election. So we've got to get in and talk about the election. And look, there's something that newspapers do on election day, on the Saturday. They all sort of editorialise. They endorse a candidate. It's an old tradition in the Australian media. Newspapers that sort of, some pretend, some don't even bother to pretend. But there's always this sort of veneer of, oh, we're independent and let you decide for yourself. Even though, as I say, that's not always necessarily the case. But on election day, they break that veneer and they go, right, this is who you should vote for. So we are a new media brand. We are the Green Canary, and we are going to tell you who to vote for too. We're going to do what the newspapers do, but with a bit of a twist. I'm not actually going to tell you today which party to vote for, which candidate to vote for. That is absolutely your business. But I'm going to tell you who you should vote for anyway. Here it comes. Drum roll. It's so obvious. Vote for climate. Absolutely vote for the candidate that you think, or the party, or both, that you think can do the best job on serious contributions from Australia towards the mitigation of climate change, and of course, the candidate or party that can pave the way towards a green future, towards a vibrant, humming economy built partially, perhaps largely, around renewable energy and other resources like that. Now, that might lead a lot of people to think, oh, well, obviously the Greens. No, I'm not talking about the Greens. I'm not talking about Labor. I'm not talking about the Teals. I'm not talking about the Coalition. I'm not talking about any particular party. It is obviously the case that parties like the Greens, there was a study last week that showed if the Greens policies were to become national policy, we'd have warming that stays more or less around the 1.5 of the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees. If we were to go full coalition, we'd be more or less heading towards the surface of Mars, walk down the street, hold out your hand and fry an egg on it. So that may have been exaggerated one way or the other. But look, there are reasons to vote from a climate perspective for nearly every party. You can vote. You can vote for the Greens. Go and vote for the Greens. Good for you. You can vote for your local Teal candidate if you have one. They have specific climate policies. Most of them are stronger than that put forward by the Labor Party. Good for you. Vote for them. You can vote Labor because they do have, for example, a 43% renewables target by 2020, as opposed to the Coalition's 26 to 28%. So you might make a pragmatic vote and vote for the Labor Party on that front. You may even, in certain seats, vote for the Coalition. There's been some things written. One of them was a pretty inflammatory column that a lot of you would have if not read, then heard about from Joe Hildebrand, the former News Corp or the News Corp columnist, former full-time News Corp journo. And he wrote, actually, if you live in Josh Frydenberg's seat and you vote for Labor, you should actually vote for Frydenberg, which would keep a moderate Liberal there. So should the Liberal Party lose the election, or the coalition lose the election, at least they'll still have a reasonably moderate leader. That was a debate that Zali Steggall absolutely destroyed with one tweet. She said, yeah, have a look at how Frydenberg has voted on all the important sort of climate and other related bills. So nonetheless, there may be a reason in your seat where to vote Liberal does something that enables something that's good for the climate or for industries that help us mitigate the effects of a warming world. That is your decision. I just think Australians, like never before, never, ever, ever before, need to vote with their climate goggles on this election. I speak for the entire Green Canary team when I say that. We said very early in this campaign that this election is no ordinary election. It's a referendum on climate. It hasn't quite turned out to be that, but neither was it necessarily a negative, although we're coming to one or two. A negative campaign on climate, as it definitely was last time. But vote hard, vote for climate, have a sausage afterwards. If the sausage was produced by a herd of cattle that in some ways didn't harm the environment and produced too many greenhouse gases, even better. Anyway, look, that is our last word, editorially speaking. But let's just move on to a little bit of election news while we're talking about the election. Dirty campaign. Yeah, it's been a dirty campaign. We've documented that in our newsletter as well. How about today's news? The group Advance Australia. Now, Advance Australia are sort of the political or polar opposite of Get Up. They were actually formed to be a Get Up on the other side of politics, to agitate for the sort of opposite of the sort of stuff that Get Up tends to agitate for. Anyway, they put up some placards in which the would-be ACT Senator David Pocock, a man very well known for being the captain of the National Rugby Union team, the Wallabies, a man also well known for his environmental activism and advocacy. Interviewed him once. He did amazing work up in South Africa with protecting rhino habitat and more. Anyway, David Pocock is running for senator on a largely green platform. Placards were put up by Advance Australia of Pocock and also of Zali Steggall, with their sort of chest pulled back, revealing a T-shirt in that kind of Superman style where you see the S. But there wasn't an S there. There was a Greens logo there, suggesting they were members of the Greens, which they are not, which is a dirty tactic, saying a vote for these independent people is actually a vote for the Greens. This is naughty, and the AEC, the Australian Electoral Commission, came out today and said exactly that. They said naughty. They actually ruled it was an offence to publish. I'm quoting here, permit or authorise to be published during the relevant period, i.e. now an election campaign, any matter or thing that is likely to mislead or deceive an elector, blah, blah, blah. So that's what's happened. Advance Australia has said they will take it down. So that's good. In other dirty politics news, look, I don't know if you saw it, but it's worth Googling. It's a good laugh. Vicky Campion, former journalist, a political staffer, also, of course, happens to be Barnaby Joyce's partner. She wrote a column in the News Corp papers this week that high-paying bush jobs will disappear under Labor. She said the six-figure salaries enjoyed by engineers and tradies in the mines will disappear under Labor's plans to transition to a net zero economy. So this was about as close as we got this time. I just mentioned a minute ago that it hasn't quite been as dirty as last time, but there have certainly been outbreaks of dirty pool. And this was about as close as we got. You know, last time they said they were coming, the coalition and commentators sort of batting for them said that Labor was coming for your utes and your weekends. I think, you know, Angus Taylor said some of that directly. Now they're coming for your pay packet, says Vicky Campion. Yeah, look, as I said at the start, the sooner the election is over, the sooner it's over, and the better for all of us. Okay, one more election-y thing. Now, this is about the floods in Queensland. Why are floods an election thing? Well, I'll tell you. We have had really bad floods, as everybody knows, pretty much all year, and a lot last year as well. 2 back-to-back La Niñas. La Niñas always make rain, always make extra moisture, and especially in Eastern Australia, but they've been particularly severe over the last 2 years with devastating floods. We interviewed a Lismore flood survivor, Eddie Lloyd, on this podcast 5 or 6 or 7 weeks ago. She is very, very upset about what's happened to her town. She absolutely links it to climate change, as do all the scientists. Of course, we've always had floods, but the worse they get, the more frequent they get. That's what's been happening. So last week we had yet more floods in Queensland, up and down the coast, from Townsville all the way down to the Gold Coast, virtually the entire length of the Queensland coastline. May rainfall records were broken in far too many locations to mention. Now, why is this an election story? It's a weather story. Well, here's the thing. In the last 3 years, weather used to be that thing they chucked at the end of the bulletin. You used to go news, sport, weather. It was almost, a throwaway. But we all talk about weather every day anyway. Weather has always been more prominent in our imagination than perhaps news and sport, especially at certain times. But weather has never been an election issue. I think weather in the last 3 years is the mystery guest on the election scene. It is the new player in the election cycle. Think about it. The Black Summer, the hottest summer on record, the hottest and driest summer on record in Australia, and the worst and most widespread bushfires. The floods, again, we've always had floods, but these were more widespread and more frequent. There have been too many to count in the last 2 years. Almost everyone you know is a victim or knows a victim of these events. I myself was a victim, helicoptered out of harm's way from a fire that burnt a third of the largest national park in New South Wales, Kosciuszko. On the same day, I was doing that hike. My wife was down the south coast in a house, staying in someone's little timber A-frame on the beach. It burnt down. It was horrific. She still has nightmares. She was on the beach for 2 nights sheltering out of harm's way with our son and our dog. We're lucky. This was not our property. Other Australians weren't so lucky, and we know this is happening more and more. We know that these events are more intense and more frequent due to climate change. We're angry about that as a people, and I think a lot of people want to vote about it, as I said a few minutes ago. So the weather, last week's floods, and pretty much all the weather nearly every week going back 3 years since the last election, the weather is one of the biggest election issues in town. But there's one other tiny little election issue. This isn't going to win anyone the election, although it's happening in some key seats in North Queensland. Most of them are Liberal National Party held seats, but they're the sort of seats that Labor considers the window open. Perhaps that is why in the seat of Herbert, just outside Townsville, Anthony Albanese this week announced a $24 million commitment to eradicate yellow crazy ants. Now, yellow crazy ants, you might not have heard of them, but they are a terrible, terrible scourge. They were imported from West Africa accidentally on shipping containers. They've been a problem in Christmas Island for a while. They wiped out a huge portion of that island's famous red crab population. The red crabs had no predators. Then came the yellow crazy ants. They're really, really, really small ants. They're smaller than most ants, but they swarm en masse. They form super colonies, and these colonies have been forming outside Townsville and at other locations up and down the Queensland coast. They can destroy forests. They can absolutely wipe out, even to the point of extinction, native animals, frogs, little birds, lizards. They are an absolute disaster. They invade people's houses. They spray acid in your eyes. Oh, lovely. Thank you, yellow crazy ants. So I just thought, election. Just have a break. Speak to a guy who knows more about crazy ants. Let's hear from James Trezise of the Invasive Species Council. James Trezise is the Conservation Director at the Invasive Species Council. He knows a lot about crazy ants, yellow crazy ants. He's actually been up to North Queensland and had a look at the little buggers for himself. How are you, James, and what did you see?
Hey, Ant, thanks for having me. Oh, look, yeah, we're up in Townsville recently, and there are 6 infestations up there, and they're crawling all through people's homes, people's sheds, and they're getting really close to some critically important environmental areas. Actually, if I was to say, it's probably one of the most imminent extinction risks that I've come across in my career. Now, these ants, they're one of the world's worst invasive species. They'll turn a forest silent, and so it's a pretty critical issue in Townsville. There's a control program up in Cairns, but yeah, we really need to get on top of it in Townsville.
So there are 6 different infestations, as you say. Do you just kind of stumble across them, or do you have to know where to go? And when you do find some, what do you see? Is the ground literally crawling, or you tell me, what do you see?
You have to look pretty hard. And so we've got a team member up there whose job it is to go out and work with the community to teach them how to lay bait traps or lures. And they're little sticky traps that they go out and survey. And you can imagine there's a lot of different ants that crawl onto those traps. And so she also has to educate people about what yellow crazy ants look like. When you do find them, as the name suggests, they're crazy. And most ants go crazy, but these critters, they're not as big as probably most people expect, but they've got really long antennae that look quite different to a native ant or most native ants. And they go mental when disturbed.
Wow. So when you say they go mental, and indeed when you say they actually are crazy, just describe the behavior for me.
Well, yeah. So the way to think about it is they will just be crawling everywhere, and they'll crawl up everything. They'll crawl up your legs. And, I was lying in a patch of them trying to get some good photos, as you do. Look, they can give you mild burns on your skin because they spray formic acid. But what they really do is they'll devastate small animals. So anything kind of smaller than a playing card, they'll take that out and take it back to super colony. And the thing with that tropical climate, the dry tropics, wet tropics, is that they can form super colonies up there. So unlike other ant species, almost any ant in a yellow crazy ant colony can become a queen. And that's what makes them such an effective invasive species. And so in one log, there's a great example. The CSIRO were doing a survey, and they stopped counting after they got past 1,000 queens.
That is a lot of ants, a lot of very crazy yellow ants. And look, I mentioned that the Labor Party has committed $24 million should they be elected to fighting that problem up there. There has been no as yet match or alternative pledge from the coalition. So, but it's a massive problem. People up there are really, really worried about it. And there are people who, won't let their kids play in their backyards. It's a massive issue. It's not good. And, the fact that they actually squirt acid. There was one guy in particular, he woke up in the middle of the night. As you do, you open your eyes when you woke up. Ants squirted acid in his eye, nearly lost his eyesight. It's a problem. Anyway, let's move on. Let's just transition to mulch, our little bits and pieces at the end. Just want to go over quickly as our first item, the reef report. We mentioned this last week. We said there was a report. It was the reef summer snapshot, which comes out each year. It had been delayed because the government was in election mode, or caretaker mode, as it's called. There was some sort of suggestion that maybe it wasn't such good news and the government wanted it suppressed. We can say nothing further about that because it was just a rumour. Nonetheless, it was interesting that after that rumour surfaced, the next day, about 6 hours after we published our podcast, out comes the report. We're not sitting on anything, is perhaps what happened. Anyway, the report comes out. It wasn't good. Now, I should say that it was wrongly reported in a couple of areas that 91% of the reef bleached. Incorrect. 91% of the reef areas that were surveyed is what bleached. They surveyed roughly a quarter of the reef. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other areas outside of that bleached and that didn't bleach. Anyway, it's a disastrous bleaching. The stats don't matter, right? A vast area of the reef has bleached. Went looking on Facebook for more information, found reef bleach deniers groups out there, knew there was climate deniers, didn't know these people existed. Not a fun evening was spent between me and them bantering. I don't know why I've fallen in that trap on Facebook. Anyway, that's what happened, but very bad news. It's the 6th bleaching event on the reef since 1998, and the Reef Summer Snapshot 2021/2022. It's linked to in our newsletter last week, and you can just go and Google it. You can find it. Anyway, some better news. Wind. We told you there would be some wind farm news, and construction has just begun on Australia's first gigawatt scale wind project. Yes, a gigawatt. And you know, how much is a gigawatt? Well, 1 gigawatt is probably more or less triple the entire wind generation capacity of Australia in the Pacific region, I believe. I mean, when you look over in Europe and in North America, you're looking at 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 gigawatts total capacity by continent. But look, we will have our first gigawatt scale project. It's the McIntyre Complex. It's in southwest Queensland. It's being built. It'll be up within a couple of years. Our current biggest one is Stockyard Hill in Victoria, which is about, it's being built as well. It's about half a gigawatt. So how much is a gigawatt going to produce in real terms? Something like powering 700,000 homes, were its energy to be transferred directly in that direction, or removing about 3 million tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere. So that is some good news. Now some bad news. An amazing report in the SMH. Actually, it was in the Age newspaper. They're all sort of the same when you read them online these days. But seabirds. Researchers have done a study. It's lasting 15 years now. It's the longest continually running seabird study. This one is on Lord Howe Island, which of course is off the New South Wales coast. I think Lord Howe's about level with Port Macquarie. So it's certainly subtropical, but it's got its own little environment. Seabirds out there, not good. Full of plastic, absolutely full of plastic. One bird that they found, a dead shearwater, which is normal. It didn't die because of the plastic. It probably died with it, possibly because of it. It had 200 pieces of plastic inside it, which is too much. Birds mistake little bits of plastics for squid. There's 100 reasons why they ingest them. Often they don't mean to ingest them. It's a terrible problem, and I think once we get past the big picture stuff, we'll never get past it, but when we have a moment beyond the big picture, climate, renewables, that sort of stuff, plastics, I believe, should be one of the environmental issues we're almost dedicated to doing our part, small though it may be, to making a difference with. But look, we promised you on the Green Canary recently when Elfie and I were talking, no more sad animal stories without a happy animal story. We would like to end on a happy animal note, and there are people out there doing good things. Came across my desk this week that researchers from the University of New South Wales are doing something with pygmy possums. Now, pygmy possums are the little animals that live in the Snowy Mountains, and they have all sorts of climate-related problems. One of the biggest ones is, as snowpack declines, they lose their winter insulating blanket. That's right, they need snow to keep warm because the snow stops the cold winds of winter and the frost at night from permeating into their burrows, which they usually make in sort of rock fields. Anyway, these UNSW researchers are taking the pygmy possums to a totally different area near Lithgow, sort of a forest environment at the foot of the Blue Mountains on the western side, and it's going pretty well so far. So climate is changing. They've got a pretty radical idea. They're thinking, let's change the whole habitat of a species and see what happens. That is not to say they're abandoning work on saving the pygmy possums in the Snowy Mountains and the Victorian Alps. They're just trying them elsewhere, and it's going pretty well so far. So we'll keep you posted on that, but I think that's a bit of good news, and it's good to end on some good news, and that'll do us for next week, and we will talk to you next week when we have a whole new political environment, no matter what shape or form that takes. But before we do depart, I just want to say that this podcast is brought to you on the land which was never ceded. by the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations. So we pay our respects to them and to elders past, present and emerging. Also just want to remind you as ever about our newsletter, hello@thegreencanary.co, and I will put you on the newsletter. We have several hundred subscribers, approaching 1,000 actually, and that is absolutely wonderful. So it's great to hear from you all. Don't forget you can chat to us on Twitter. We've got about 50 new followers again this week. Hello to everybody. We are at Green Canary Pod there, and we are at Green Canary Media on Instagram. That is about it for today. I will talk to you after the election. Have a great week. Vote hard. Bye.